Good morning, AP Gov students. Okay, the subject for today, for our review in preparation for the AP exam, is to talk about the presidency and then the bureaucracy. Okay? So if we look at the review sheet, to get us started, we can talk about the basics. Okay, as you know, the age requirement is 35. There are some of the candidates, Democratic candidates running for president now, who are much younger than some of the others, right? You have to be a natural-born citizen. That's generally taken to mean that you're born in the United States or on United States territory. You must also you must have lived here for 14 years, I believe it is, okay? And then when you run, the length of your term, according to Article 2, is 4 years. And under the 12th Amendment and under the 20th Amendment, if you somehow can no longer serve, then the Vice President takes over for you. Why do we need two amendments for that? Because they talk about different occurrences, different circumstances that arise that result in the President's departure. Okay? Then there's the 25th Amendment in terms of constitutional provisions that you need to talk about. There's the 25th Amendment. It also talks about presidential succession. It tells us that Congress can set forth a plan for what can happen after the Vice President. More importantly, the 25th Amendment talks about what happens in case of presidential disability. If the President is unable to serve for some reason, to fulfill the President's duties. Okay, and one thing the President can do is the President can write to the Congress and say, I can't fulfill the President's duties, I'm going to have the Vice President take over for me, in cases perhaps of surgery or something like that. The other kinds of circumstances, however, which have been discussed to some extent with regard to President Trump, have to do with whether or not, with when a President is unable to serve but will not or cannot himself write to the Congress and say, I can't serve. In that case, the Vice President and a majority of the Cabinet can write to the Congress and say the President is unable to serve. Okay? And then that means that the Vice President takes over until the President himself writes the Congress back and says, I'm okay. And if the Cabinet and Congress and the President disagree about this, then the Congress has to decide. We haven't ever had that happen, but it will be interesting if we ever do. The foundational document that you have to be aware of with regard to the presidency is Federalist 70 by Hamilton. In Federalist 70, Hamilton talks about the importance of a single executive as opposed to a committee or a group. He talks about the importance of, the reasons for that are that the president needs to be strong, needs to be nimble, needs to be quick, that sort of thing. So make sure you go over Federalist 70 to make sure that you're prepared to answer questions about it. One of the themes that you need to keep in mind now that we've gone over the basics is that the presidential powers have expanded. They have changed, they have adapted, and they have expanded over time, especially beginning in the 20th century, right? There are several reasons for this. Some of them include the increased importance of what Hamilton talked about in Federalist 70, the increased importance of the need for the president to be able to respond quickly in cases of national crisis. Okay, the world is both a smaller place and a faster place because of technology, and that increases the importance of having one person rather than a group have to decide what to do. The government is larger. Okay, so the presidential powers have expanded to some extent because the government is larger. We have a bureaucracy now, which we really didn't have before the New Deal, and that requires the president to increase his chief executive powers. Okay, and another thing that's affected the president's power is that the Congress really hasn't restrained the president. When the president has taken on either new or expanded power, the Congress hasn't said much about it. There are some exceptions like the War Powers Resolution, although that turned out not to be much of an exception either. So Congress bears some of the responsibility. Now, we talked about some presidential roles, and we talked about presidential powers. Those are different things. The roles can be either formal or informal, or involve formal or informal powers. A power is formal if it is specifically listed in the Constitution. Power is informal if it is not, if it's basically read in between the lines or it's arisen through tradition and custom. So, what are the presidential roles? Well, one of them is head of state. Let's get me off of this and show you something more interesting. Okay, head of state. So this involves dealing with foreign countries and the representatives of foreign countries. There's chief executive, which basically means running the government. It's like being a chief executive officer of a company. You have to manage the employees, the personnel. You have to manage the strategy. You have to manage the direction in which your company is going. Right? Another role is to be commander-in-chief. Now, the head of state role and the chief executive and commander-in-chief are, to some extent, some more than others, expressly listed in the Constitution, and so there are formal powers associated with them. The president is the chief legislator. This involves things like the State of the Union message. We'll talk about that and it also involves signing bills into law or perhaps even vetoing them. An informal role is that the president is the leader of his or her political party. So right now, President Trump is the leader of the Republican Party. The president is a crisis manager, which comes when there's a threat to national security, or perhaps the previous president has died, or we are attacked. The president is a moral persuader. Okay, they can go out and try to get what they want, even if they don't have the power, by convincing somebody else to do it, like Congress. Okay, so now we need to talk about the formal powers of the president. Sorry, I'm having a hard time. There we go. Okay. The formal powers of the president include, as we were mentioning, the commander-in-chief. And the commander-in-chief, the responsibilities of the commander-in-chief are to supervise the military, to give commissions to officers, and to make determinations about what the policy will be in the military. Now, after the Vietnam War and the problems with Nixon, the Congress passed the War Powers Resolution, which tried to put some limits on the president's exercise of power as commander-in-chief. Because after all, the Congress has the power to declare war, not the president, even though the president controls the military. All right? So the War Powers Resolution basically required the president to keep in touch with the Congress if the president was going to use troops. The president is supposed to talk to Congress beforehand about using troops, and once he does, he's supposed to either, if the Congress hasn't already approved, then the president has 60 days, and then if the Congress still hasn't approved, then the president's got to get out in 30 days. So it's a total of basically 90 days. The War Powers Resolution hasn't been used very often. It's recently we actually did have a congressional vote calling on the president to get out of a foreign area, Yemen, where there are just tragedies galore happening in Yemen. Okay, and the president vetoed it. Which seems kind of weird that the president should be able to do that. But what could the Congress do? It could go back and overturn the veto. That's not going to happen, though, because they can't get enough votes in the Senate to overcome the 60 vote requirement. Okay? Now, what about the chief executive power of the president? I'm still here. I'm just struggling with... I wanted to get to this in the slideshow. Okay. Now, I just wanted to go over this slide because it has a lot of stuff that is involved with the chief executive basically running the government. For one thing, the Constitution requires the president to faithfully execute the laws of the country. That's the enforcement power. That's why we say the executive enforces or implements the law. The president can deal with the executive departments, the Department of Commerce, the Department of State, and all of those departments, and ask for advice from the heads of those departments. The chief executive power includes pardons, although you could also describe that as part of the judicial power that the presidency has a touch of. The president nominates judges for the Supreme Court and for the other officers and fills vacancies that may happen. Okay? Now, as head of state, the head of state, the president negotiates and signs treaties, negotiates and signs executive agreements, which are different than treaties, and appoints ambassadors, those people who represent the United States in foreign countries. Okay? As a chief, now, among those tasks, the treaties are formal powers, agreements are informal powers, and the appointment of ambassadors are formal powers. Okay? It's formal if it's in the Constitution and informal if it's not. As the chief legislator, the president gives the State of the Union message, which is a formal power. It's required in the Constitution, and also signs or vetoes bills, as I said before. Another formal power. Now, what about the informal powers? Let's go down and list the things that the president can do. And this is aside from the informal roles, like the moral persuader, which the president also does, obviously. But these are some things that are more particular. First of all, there are executive orders. Executive orders are issued by the president with respect to the bureaucracy. They can only extend as far as the president's power extends to control the bureaucracy. So what executive orders tend to do is to require some part or all of the bureaucracy to change a policy. Okay, for example, in 1948, President Truman decided to desegregate the military. The way he did that was through an executive order. He said that the military had to desegregate. Okay, now he could do that because the military was within his range of power. All right. In the 90s, Clinton and the military agreed on the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, also about the military, but this time about LGBTQ rights. Okay, and they decided that. And Clinton instructed the military that what they were to do from then on was not to ask anybody whether they were gay, but if it got brought up, then it could be prosecuted. Okay, and they could be kicked out of the military, which is what they did then. And then finally, when President Obama decided to stop all of that, he issued another executive order saying that LGBTQ people would be welcome in the military, except obviously, President Trump has reversed that with regard specifically to transgender persons. Okay, next, executive agreements. Executive agreements are informal contracts, agreements between us, the U.S., and other countries. Okay. They usually relate to things like trade. They're less important than treaties. And they're different than treaties in that treaties require Congress, the Senate, not Congress, but the Senate, to affirm them, to approve them. That's one of the parts of the Senate's advice and consent function. Okay? Executive agreements don't require Senate approval. So they tend not to be about things that are as important. They're trade deals, like I said, usually. And Bush reached one that had to do with nuclear disarmament once, but they tend to be things that the Senate, that the president doesn't think the Congress would care that much about anyway, in terms of specifically approving. Okay. Now, executive privilege is another power of the president. It's informal. It rises from the law. There are lots of privileges in the law. One of them that you might know about is the attorney-client privilege, which protects communications between an attorney and the attorney's clients from discovery, so that people can confide freely in their attorney. There's an executive privilege which covers the workings of the executive, basically. It basically says that the president shouldn't have to disclose things that are about the working relationships they have in the White House. Okay, the point of this is that the president doesn't want to have somebody looking over his shoulder all the time. Okay, which is reasonable, and you can have negative effects from that kind of thing. There are limits on the executive privilege, though it has been recognized. Nixon tried to use it to protect the tapes, the audio tapes from his office, and he failed in the Supreme Court. So Trump seems to think right now that he's going to be able to protect things. One of his problems is that some of the material that he's trying to protect right now is stuff that has already been disclosed. He already agreed to let members of his staff talk to the special counsel, and they did, and now Trump wants to close the door again after the horse is already out of the barn. I thought you'd like that expression. Okay. Signing statements. Presidents, this is relatively recent, and it's done when a president signs a bill that Congress has passed. The president doesn't like something in the bill or thinks that it should be interpreted in a certain way to avoid perhaps unconstitutionality or just because the president doesn't like it. And what they do in their signing statement is they explain their understanding of the bill and what they think it means that they have to do. Okay? So it's a way for presidents kind of try to place limits on the interpretation of bills. It hasn't been tested very much, and they don't really have legal impact, but they do tell the world what the president thinks about the bill. Okay, and as we said, there are also the president's informal roles that have informal obligations, not obligations, but informal responsibilities. I think the president would agree with. Moral persuader and crisis manager and political party leader, and what's the other one? Oh, yeah. Wait a minute. Chief legislator. The Constitution doesn't actually say chief legislator, so I guess that's why we call it an informal role. All right? Okay. Let's page down. Now, we've talked about the president's roles and powers. Let's talk about the checks on the president's power. Okay? There are formal checks and there are informal checks. The formal checks are checks that belong to Congress or that belong to the judiciary or that are in Article 2 itself of the Constitution. So Article 2's checks, obviously they limit you to a four-year term until you have to be reelected. You have to be elected by the Electoral College. Those are checks that the Constitution places on the presidents. Now, Congress has a lot of checks on the president. First of all, they can pass legislation that disagrees or overcomes something that the president has done in some cases. Second, the House can impeach and the Senate can try a president for what the Constitution calls treason or bribery or high crimes and misdemeanors. Those don't have to be specifically crimes. They can be things like abuse of power, okay, which was one of the things that they were going to charge Nixon with. Another thing that Congress can do to check the president is to override a presidential veto, which, however, is very difficult and rarely happens. The Senate has what we call an advice and consent function. Those are the terms that the Constitution uses, advice and consent. And that ability by the Senate applies to several different things. It applies to treaties. They have to confirm treaties by a 2/3 vote. I think it's 2/3. Doesn't matter. They have to confirm judges, and they have to confirm senior officials. Now, a lot of these are by 60 votes because, of course, that's what the Senate requires. Okay, they dropped the 60-vote requirement. They can drop the 60-vote requirement, which they have done with regard to some judges. Obama did the Congress during Obama's administration did the same thing. So you don't really have to know one way or the other. But what you do need to know is that whatever judicial nominations the president makes, the Senate has to confirm. Also, the president's nominations of senior officials have to be confirmed by the Senate. So those senior officials would include all of the heads of the departments. They would include the heads of the independent regulatory agencies. They would include senior officials in the departments that aren't the heads. Okay? Now, what else can the Congress do to control the president? Let's talk money. Okay? It's about the money, right? And the Congress controls the budget. and controls how the revenue is raised. All revenue bills have to originate in the House. So the president is limited by that. That's what we're seeing with the wall. The president wants to build the wall between us and Mexico, and Congress won't fund it. Those are informal checks by the Congress. The check by the judiciary is basically one, but a very powerful one. They can declare acts of the president unconstitutional. So any action, it could be an executive order, it could be anything else the president does that could be declared unconstitutional. All right? What about informal checks on the president's power? Because those exist. All right? For one thing, there's public opinion. Public opinion affects what a president does and what the president's willing to propose or what the president may withdraw. So, for example, recently the president proposed Herman Cain to be one of the Federal Reserve Board members. And Herman Cain has now withdrawn his name, and President Trump graciously accepted, which, of course, President Trump may have asked him to do that in the first place. Okay, because the public response was not positive. Okay. The media, of course, is a very strong check on the president. The media serves a watchdog function for all parts of government, including the president. They keep track of what the president does and let the public know about it so that the public themselves can express their opinions. Partisan politics is a check on the president. Even if you can get along with your own party, which sometimes doesn't happen, you've got to deal with the other party. And as we've seen, the fact that the House has been taken over by the Democrats, whereas it was previously run by the Republicans during Trump's administration, that's making a difference. It's going to make a difference in terms of what Trump can accomplish legislatively. It's going to make a difference in what the House investigates in terms of Trump's behavior, because the House and the Senate did very little investigation in the first 2 years of Trump's administration. But now the House, controlled by the Democrats, is doing quite a bit. Trump is resisting, not surprisingly. Congressional investigations, whether partisan or not, are a control on the president, a check on the president. When you have to have your people come and testify in front of the Senate or the House committees, or you have to account for some action that you've taken, it does affect your behavior. And interest groups also can affect what a president does, basically in the same way that public opinion does, because interest groups basically want to get public opinion going. That's one of the things they want to do, is to generate grassroots interest. Interest groups also can be part of iron triangles and can affect a president that way through a member of the bureaucracy or a member of the Congress. My nose itches, I'm sorry. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the people that work with the president, because some of those, you just need to be familiar with their name. It seems to me that the College Board usually asks a question about this on the multiple choice. So the people on the president's staff are not people that the president has to get the Senate's approval for. Okay, that's the important thing to remember about them. Who are these people? Well, for one thing, they're the White House counsel. That's the attorney that represents the president as the president. It's not a personal attorney, it's a presidential attorney. So if Congress challenges something that the president does as president, the White House counsel helps out with that. One of the White House counsel, the first one that President Trump had, managed to get a lot of conservative judges approved. That's one of his claims to fame. The press secretary obviously deals with the press, is supposed to usually gives press conferences. That's kind of fallen by the wayside because, frankly, nobody trusts Sarah Sanders, who's the press secretary. The president has a chief of staff, probably the most important person. That person controls or manages the president's calendar and manages the personnel in the office. And that might sound like not a big deal, but it's a very big deal. Controlling access to the president is very important. Another member of the presidential staff are speechwriters. They write speeches, okay, and help with communications. There is a person on the staff in charge of legislative affairs, basically involved in dealing with Congress and trying to interact with them. The National Security Advisor is the President's advisor on security and is head of the National Security Council, which includes various people that advise on national security. And then there's the Director of the Office of Management and Budget, and you definitely need to know about this because they may ask you about the Office of Management and Budget. The Office of Management and Budget, otherwise known as the OMB, basically takes care of the process, handles the process of putting the president's proposed budget together. So they go out to different parts of the bureaucracy and they collect all the proposed budgets, and then they work with the president on coming up with a final budget to send to the Congress. Now, moving along from the presidential staff, okay, in terms of presidential themes, there are a lot of tensions with Congress, okay? There are executive branch appointments that have to be ratified. There are judiciary nominees that have to be ratified, and those are really serious because they're life tenure. There are the executive orders that Congress doesn't like and that often a presidency uses precisely because Congress won't do what the president wants. And there are conflicts over policy, legislation that the president wants and the Congress doesn't want, or particular provisions that the Congress wants and the president doesn't want. There are also tensions with the cabinet, even though that's supposedly the president's group. There are people that are nominated by him. There are policies may differ from the president's, okay? In part because most of the cabinet departments are made up of employees, regular employees. They're generally professionals, okay? And they've been there for a long time, and they're not subject to the political whims of Washington, all right? So those conflicts sometimes percolate up through the heads of the departments. Sometimes there's tension between the members of the department and the heads of the departments, and that sort of thing. So those tensions exist also. Finally, in talking about the presidency, we need to talk about the media. The media. Media is very, very important for government, as we've talked about a lot. And it can affect the president. It can be an informal check on the president. If the media really rails about something, the president sometimes backs off. Trump even sometimes backs off under those circumstances. What the president wants to be able to do is to use the media to her advantage, okay? She wants to be able to manipulate them, to have them present when the president says great things that people will like, and have them not present when the president is talking crap, okay? So one of the things we talk about, we call this presidential ability to attract media, okay? Because after all, the president is one person. Okay, only one person, and everybody votes on this one person, and the media pays a lot of attention to this one person. So the president can attract media and engage and use what we call the bully pulpit. The bully pulpit. A pulpit, for those of you who don't know, is the lectern, the podium that exists in a church. And a bully pulpit basically means using that power and beating people over the head with it, okay? So Trump has been very good with that with his rallies. He gets the media to come to his rallies. Okay. All right. That is presidency. So we're going to move on to the bureaucracy. I see no messages from anybody. Okay. The bureaucracy, of course, is part of the executive department, okay, which is headed by the presidency. And we talked about the president's chief executive function for managing the bureaucracy. Right? The bureaucracy, like any other bureaucracy, has several particular characteristics. It's large. Bureaucracies are always large. Second, they have worker specialization. The people who work in a bureaucracy have a particular job that they do. And they have technical competence. Usually those workers are good at the job that they do. They're trained for that job and they have experience at the job. There is a hierarchy, okay? A pyramidal hierarchy where there's somebody at the top, which in the case of the federal bureaucracy is the president, and there are people who are members of the administration filtering down to the bottom, okay? There are written rules in bureaucracies, sometimes, often interpreted rigidly. Okay, and bureaucracies communicate through in ways that can be kept as records. Okay. Okay, I'm back. Okay, that's basically the federal bureaucracy. Those are the features of it. It's large, though the people they don't get paid very much, but they do have job security. Okay, that's one of the good things about being a federal government employee. There aren't enough people to do the federal government's jobs. People generally dislike the federal bureaucracy, but have good experiences with individuals when they deal with it. Now, there are 3 essential functions of the federal bureaucracy. One of them is implementation, basically putting the laws of Congress and any orders by the president into practice. One of them is regulation, okay, making rules for people. And one of them is administration, basically running things, the day-to-day business of collecting paperwork from people and making investigations of whether or not this person should get Social Security and making the decision about that and informing people about that. That's, those things, taxes, all sorts of things are part of the everyday operation, routine operation of the federal bureaucracy. Okay, let's talk about the types of federal agencies. This is the most important, pretty close to the most important thing you need to know about this, aside from iron triangles, okay? So the first type of agency is a cabinet department, okay? Cabinet department are the ones that you know probably the best. You need to go over the list of cabinet departments before you take the AP exam. They include Commerce, Department of State, Department of Treasury, the Department of Justice, the Department of Defense, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Energy, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Department of Education. Did I say that already? And I haven't covered them all. Department of the Interior. I haven't covered them all, but that's close. Okay? And at the head of each one of those departments is usually what we call a secretary for most of them. There is an exception for the Department of Justice. The head of the Department of Justice is called the Attorney General. The Attorney General. Okay? He's been in the spotlight because of the Mueller report. Now, cabinet departments are the essential organizing structure of the bureaucracy, but there are many, many, many agencies outside of the cabinet structure. So keep that in mind. Most of the bureaucracy is within the cabinets, but there is a significant portion of it that is outside. A portion that's not terribly large, but that's significant in terms of subject matter. Okay? So let's talk about some of those departments that are outside of cabinet departments. First of all, independent executive agencies. Okay? These, like the independent regulatory agencies that we're going to talk about, are both located outside of the cabinet departments. It could be because people didn't want them to be influenced by what would go on in that department. Okay? They would be too subject to various forms of influence. Okay? The independent executive agencies basically perform a service function. Okay? They perform a service function. They do things for people, for citizens. An example is the Social Security Agency. Okay? They help people with their Social Security problems. Another example is the Central Intelligence Agency. They perform services. They spy, among other things. They do intelligence. Okay? Now, the other kind of independent agency is independent regulatory agencies. Independent executive agencies, the president has a little more control over. He nominates the person to head it and basically can fire the person that heads it. With independent regulatory agencies, the president does nominate a person for the job. The Senate has to approve that person. And then they can't be fired except for cause. So they have some independence that other agencies don't. Usually, independent regulatory agencies regulate economic activity as opposed to service activity. So some of the examples are the Securities and Exchange Commission, okay? The Federal Trade Commission, the Federal Communications Commission. Those are all independent regulatory agencies. The EPA, okay? Those are all regulating economic activity, right? Usually they are run by a commission or board, and the head of that board or commission is the person that the Senate has to confirm, okay? Independent regulatory agencies, some people challenge as sort of a constitutional violation because they have not only administrative functions, which other agencies have, but they have some legislative functions because they make rules, okay? And they have judicial functions because they evaluate whether or not people have violated those rules. For example, the EPA makes rules about how to implement Congress's laws, which things are actually violations. And then they go out and enforce those rules, okay, and prosecute people who they believe have violated those rules. Okay? Okay, so that's cabinet departments. Cabinet departments and independent executive agencies and independent regulatory agencies. If you have to forget about something, don't forget about the independent regulatory agencies. Okay? Now, finally, you have government corporations. Government corporations are corporations. They're organized like a corporation. Why are they called government corporations? Because the government contributes money to them. They lose money. And the government helps them because the government thinks it's in their interest. One of these is the U.S. Postal Service, which the U.S. government historically actually ran until they incorporated it. Okay, one of them is Amtrak, the passenger railroad service. Another one is the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Okay, now the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation is subsidized because they may have to pay out costs. Okay, although they do try. I don't know how they do that. I don't know whether banks have to pay money into the FDIC specifically, but somehow we're collecting money that way to pay for the FDIC payouts. Okay. Now, bureaucracy is obviously powerful because it's huge, but what about individual parts of the bureaucracy? Okay. What gives them their power? Okay. They get their power from discretion. Any member of the bureaucracy has opportunities to exercise discretion with regard to rules. The IRS, for example, can give you a break on your taxes if they decide that there's a good reason for it. If you make your case for a break, they can decide that you're willfully violating your taxes and prosecute you for that. Okay, these are all things that they have discretion. They have the ability to decide on their own what to do about that. This discretion gives them a lot of power. It's probably a good thing that they have some discretion because when you have a bureaucracy enforcing rules rigidly, you don't have the ability to adapt to different circumstances. Okay, but there are people who complain about this discretion. Okay, and in addition to the discretion, they are the discretion basically comes up when they do implement rules, okay? Not just when they make paperwork decisions, but when the EPA decides what rules to have and how to implement them, all right? That's where they get their power. It's important to remember that, okay? And then something we've already talked about in with regard to Congress is iron triangles, otherwise known as issue networks. Issue networks, as I think most of you remember now, are composed of three components. Number one, they all have to do with the same subject area. Okay, so they're all concerned about the same topic of material. So the first part is some member of a congressional committee or subcommittee, not Congress itself, but a committee or subcommittee that specifically addresses this subject matter. The second part is somebody in the bureaucracy that also deals with this subject matter. So, for example, you could have somebody on the Energy Committee in the House, I believe there's an Energy Committee in the House, who is in an iron triangle with someone who is in the EPA, okay? And then the third part is an interest group, okay? So perhaps the Sierra Club is also involved in this iron triangle. All three of them are concerned about energy and the effect on the environment, okay? Oftentimes, iron triangles, the members of iron triangles don't always agree with each other, though sometimes they do have a common interest. that they want to push, sometimes they negotiate with each other to do things for each other. So, for example, what an interest group can do for the member of Congress is to provide technical expertise. We know that's the thing that they provide the most. We know that what Congress can do for the member of Congress can do for the bureaucracy is to try to get them more money for the budget. Okay? All those kinds of things are interactions among these three components in an iron triangle. Now, we need to talk briefly about the civil service. You definitely need to know what it is. Okay? The civil service is basically the government, the federal government employment system, employment and personnel system. Okay? It used to be that people got government jobs through political patronage, also called the spoils system. Okay? You got it because you knew the president and the president owed you something or liked you for some reason. Okay? But most federal-based employment is merit-based now. Not all of it, because obviously the president appoints heads of cabinets and all sorts of people like that. But the rest of federal employment is merit-based, meaning you have to earn the job and you have to perform the job properly in order to keep the job. Although it's hard to get a federal employee fired, it is definitely possible. Okay? There are limitations on federal employees. They can't talk about politics, basically, especially while they're at work. And they can't... what else was I going to say? That's basically the one you need to know, is that they can't talk about politics while they're at work. Okay? All right, what are the checks on the bureaucracy? Obviously, this is important. Okay? The president checks the bureaucracy because the president manages the bureaucracy. The president has some control over appointees who are not merit-based employees. The president can essentially fire a cabinet secretary if the president wants to. The president has control over the policies that are supposed to be implemented by the bureaucracy. They're supposed to be doing what he wants to in certain areas, not every area. For example, the president can't control the Department of Justice and say, I've decided I want a policy where we let all the poor people go to prison and we have all the rich people get out. We have that close to that now, but let's say we have an actual policy on that, all right? And I want you to enforce that. The Justice Department is not gonna agree to that, okay? There is some independence from the presidency for certain departments, and the Justice Department is supposed to be one of them. And that's one of the things that Trump has been doing that has bothered people, that he's tried to manipulate and essentially obstruct justice, according to the evidence. Congress's checks on the bureaucracy. First of all, Congress does oversight, right? They can haul the bureaucracy into Congress and have hearings in front of a committee or subcommittee and ask them to account for themselves, to show how they're implementing congressional legislation and whether they're doing what they're supposed to do. Congress has control over the budget. So if they don't like what you're doing, they can cut down your budget or they can reallocate the budget. Okay. Congress can refuse to confirm nominees for for bureaucracy positions and things like that. Okay. Congress, by the way, another way that Congress performs oversight over the bureaucracy is that they require written reports often. It's not just hearings that they use to find out what's going on. They also get written reports from members of the bureaucracy who are responsible for whatever area the Congress is investigating. Federal courts, of course, can do what they can always do, which is declare an action by a bureaucracy to be unconstitutional, or they can declare it to be against the law. Okay, so a bureaucracy might do something that is against the law rather than being unconstitutional. Could be both. Maybe they're not even following their own law. Okay, so those are the checks on the bureaucracy, and that is the end of my lecture on the bureaucracy. I will check with you for my next episode.